Okay, so this literally just happened to me and I'm still trying to process the whole thing. My name's Ryan. I'm 26. Just a regular guy from Montana working at the local agricultural co-op. My job is pretty simple. I load crates all day, haul equipment. Nothing fancy, but it pays the bills and keeps me outdoors, which I love. Every year, the co-op sends a few of us to this agricultural conference in Bozeman. It's no big deal. Just a quick flight on a small prop plane, couple hours max. I've done it before, totally routine. But this time, man, everything changed in ways I never could have imagined. I showed up at the tiny airstrip in Helena that morning completely exhausted. The co-op had me loading crates until midnight, and I was running on black coffee and basically fumes at that point. The plane was this beat-up, twin-engined Cessna. You know, the kind that's seen better days, but still gets the job done. There were about 8 of us on board that day, a few executives from the union, some farmers like me, and the pilot up front. I boarded last, dragging my duffel bag full of extra tools, and squeezed into my assigned seat near the back. That's when I noticed her. Rebecca Martinez, 43, the head of HR for the statewide agricultural union. I'd seen her around the office a few times before, always in these sharp suits with a clipboard in hand, barking orders in that no-nonsense tone that made everyone straighten up. She was known for being ice cold, never cracked a smile unless it was part of some HR protocol, and she had this way of looking through people like they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. The rumors about her were pretty consistent. Divorced, no kids, married to her work, all business, no play. I figured she was completely out of my league in every possible way. Older, smarter, way higher up the chain than a grunt like me. I nodded politely as I sat down next to her, but she barely glanced up from her laptop. Her fingers were just flying across the keys like the rest of the world didn't even exist. The plane taxied down the runway, with the engines rumbling like an old truck. I buckled in, leaned back against the seat, and stared out the window as we lifted off into the Montana sky. The landscape unfolded below us, all those jagged peaks capped with early snow, dense forests that looked like they could swallow you whole, and rivers snaking through the valleys like silver threads. It was peaceful at first, the kind of view that makes you forget about your sore muscles and early morning wake-up call. Rebecca was still buried in her work beside me, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, completely focused. I stole a few glances at her when I thought she wouldn't notice. Her dark hair was pulled back in this tight bun, her face set in that concentrated expression. She was attractive in a way that kind of snuck up on you. Strong features, clear skin, the kind of confidence that comes from years of commanding rooms full of rough necks like me. But I kept my mouth shut because there was clearly no point in small talk with someone who obviously wasn't interested. About 20 minutes into the flight, everything went completely to hell. The plane jolted hard like we'd hit a massive pothole in the sky. My stomach flipped, and I gripped the armrest so tight my knuckles went white. I muttered something under my breath and looked around at the other passengers, who were all shifting uneasily and murmuring nervously. Rebecca paused her typing for the first time, and her eyes flicked to the window. Then came another shake, way stronger this time, and the engine started whining in this totally unnatural way. Alarms started blaring from the cockpit, these sharp, piercing beeps that cut through the cabin like knives. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, and I could hear the strain and urgency in every word. "Folks, we've got an engine failure. Brace for impact. Emergency landing incoming." Panic absolutely erupted in that cabin. People were screaming, grabbing for oxygen masks as they dropped from the ceiling. The plane tilted sharply, and we started nose-diving toward the mountains below. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer, and adrenaline just flooded through my entire body. I could see the trees rushing up at us through the window, those snow-dusted peaks closing in fast. This was it. I was completely sure we were done for. Bags started tumbling from the overhead bins, papers flying everywhere. The guy across the aisle from me was praying out loud, and his voice was shaking so bad I could barely make out the words. I turned to Rebecca, and my mind was just racing. Her laptop had slid to the floor, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw real, genuine fear in her eyes. They were wide and unblinking, her face as pale as the snow outside the window. She was clutching the armrest so hard her knuckles had turned completely white, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. Without even thinking about it, I reached over and grabbed her hand. It was cold and clammy, but she didn't pull away like I thought she might. Instead, she squeezed back, and her grip was desperate, like I was the only anchor she had in this storm. Our eyes locked for just a split second, in the middle of all that chaos and noise. The plane shuddered violently, and the metal was groaning like it was about to tear itself apart. Then Rebecca whispered something, and even over the alarms, I could hear her voice trembling but clear. "If we make it out of this, I'll tell you why I never look anyone in the eye." I didn't have time to process what she meant. Why was she telling me this? Why now? But in that moment, with death literally staring us down, it felt like the most important thing in the entire world. I nodded and held on tighter to her hand. "We'll make it," I said, even though I honestly didn't believe my own words. Then came the impact. The plane slammed into the mountainside with this deafening crash that I can still hear in my head. We were skidding through trees that snapped like matchsticks. Glass was shattering everywhere. Flames were licking at the wings, and the fuselage twisted like it was made of tin foil. I got thrown forward, and my seatbelt dug into my gut so hard I thought it might cut me in half. Pain exploded everywhere. The world was just spinning. All I could hear were screams and smell smoke and that acrid, burning fuel smell. Then everything went black. When I finally came to, my head was throbbing like someone had hit me with a sledgehammer. I groaned and tasted blood in my mouth as I pushed debris off my chest. The cabin was absolutely destroyed. Seats were ripped from the floor, wires were dangling everywhere, smoke was curling up from the wreckage. Snow was drifting in through these gaping holes in the fuselage, and the cold was already biting into my skin. I unbuckled with shaking hands and somehow staggered to my feet, even though every single muscle in my body was screaming in pain. I called out, asking if anyone else was okay, but my voice came out hoarse and weak. The only response was silence, broken by the wind howling through the trees outside. Bodies were slumped in their seats, lifeless. The pilot's cockpit was completely crushed. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might throw up. I was the only one moving. Then I saw her. Rebecca was just a few feet away, half buried under a collapsed panel. Her leg was twisted at this odd angle, and blood was seeping from a gash on her arm. I shouted her name and scrambled over the wreckage to reach her. I shoved the debris aside, and my hands were slick with blood, but I couldn't even tell if it was hers or mine. She stirred and coughed weakly, and her eyes fluttered open. "Ryan," she murmured, and she sounded so disoriented and confused. Relief just flooded through me like a wave. She was alive. We were both alive somehow. But as I helped her sit up, the full reality of our situation hit me like a ton of bricks. No phones worked out here, no signal in this remote stretch of the Rockies. It was just us. The endless forest stretching in every direction, and the fading light of day as the sun started to dip behind the peaks. We were stranded miles from anywhere with winter closing in fast. And in that frozen silence, her whispered words from the plane kept echoing in my head. Whatever secret she was holding, whatever wall she'd built around herself all these years, it was all stripped away now. We had to survive together, or we weren't going to survive at all. Those first few days in the wilderness were absolutely brutal. Every single moment was a fight against the cold, the hunger, and this gnawing fear that nobody was ever going to find us out here. The crash site looked like a nightmare. Twisted metal was scattered all across the slope. The flames had long since gone out, but the smell of charred wiring still hung in the air like some kind of bad omen. Snow flurries were whipping around us, and the temperature was dropping fast as the sun disappeared behind the peaks. I helped Rebecca to her feet, and her face twisted in pain from the gash on her arm and her twisted ankle. She leaned on me heavily, and I could feel how much it hurt her, but there was this determination in her eyes that told me she wasn't about to give up without a fight. "We need shelter," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I actually felt inside. She nodded and started scanning the wreckage with this sharp gaze that I'm sure she used in boardroom crisis meetings back in her old life. Together, we scavenged whatever we could find that might be useful. We pulled a ripped section of the plane's fuselage to use as a windbreak, grabbed emergency blankets from the first aid kit, and went through scattered luggage, looking for anything edible or that could help us survive. I dragged the largest piece of debris I could move, this chunk of the wing, and propped it up against a cluster of boulders to form a makeshift lean-to shelter. Rebecca, despite her injuries, started gathering dry branches from under the trees, and her hands were trembling as she stacked them near our shelter. "Here," she said, handing me a lighter from her purse. "I guess executives carry these for who knows what reason." I flicked it a few times, and after several attempts, a small fire finally crackled to life. The warmth cut through the chill like an actual lifeline, and we both just sat close to it, letting the flames cast flickering shadows on our faces. Her arm was bleeding pretty steadily, so I started to tear a strip from my shirt to wrap it, but she stopped me. She pulled off her belt with a wince. "Use this," she insisted, as she looped it around my own scraped-up leg first. "You're no good to either of us if you can't walk." It was honestly the first time she'd ever spoken to me like an equal, not like some underling who showed up late to a meeting. I let her tie it off, and the leather bit into my skin, but then I returned the favor on her arm. Our hands brushed against each other, and it was accidental, but it sent this spark through me that had absolutely nothing to do with the fire we'd built. As night fell, the forest came alive with all these sounds. There were distant howls, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional rustle in the bushes that made my heart race every single time. We rationed the few protein bars and water bottles we'd managed to find in the wreckage, and at first, we ate in complete silence. Rebecca just stared into the flames, with her cracked glasses still perched on her nose, and I could see that whole HR boss facade cracking right along with them. I finally broke the quiet. "You okay?" I asked her. "Besides the obvious, I mean." She glanced over at me and her expression softened just a tiny fraction. "Physically, I'll live," she said. "Mentally, I'm not so sure." She paused for a moment, then added something that caught me off guard. "Thank you for grabbing my hand back there on the plane. I didn't expect that from you." I shrugged and poked at the fire with a stick. "Seemed like the thing to do," I said. "We're in this together now, whether we like it or not." She nodded slowly and pulled her knees up despite the pain it caused her injured ankle. That's when I remembered what she'd said on the plane right before we crashed. That promise to tell me her secret about why she never looked anyone in the eye. But I didn't push her on it right then. Survival had to come first, and we had way bigger problems to deal with. The next morning, the reality of our situation sank in even deeper. There were no rescue choppers flying overhead, no distant shouts from search teams, nothing but silence. We were truly alone in the Montana backcountry, where winters could kill you faster than any plane crash ever could. I went back to scavenging more from the wreckage and managed to find a flare gun with one shot left in it, a multi-tool that would come in handy, and some canned goods that had somehow survived the impact. Rebecca helped as best as she could with her injuries, limping around slowly to collect pine needles for bedding, so we could insulate ourselves from the frozen ground at night. "We need to conserve our energy," she said in that practical voice, like she was running some kind of staff meeting. But I could hear the vulnerability underneath it now, something I'd never heard from her back at the office. As we worked side by side, she started opening up just a little bit. "I've always been the one in control," she admitted, while we were fortifying the shelter with more branches. Meetings, deadlines, personnel files. But this, she gestured around at the wilderness. "This strips it all away, doesn't it?" I nodded as I hammered a stake into the frozen ground with a rock. "Yeah, out here, it's just us versus the mountain," I said. "No titles, no hierarchies. None of that matters anymore." By the second evening, exhaustion hit us both really hard. We huddled close by the fire as the temperature plummeted way below freezing. Rebecca's ankle had swollen up bad, and her arm was throbbing, but she absolutely refused to complain about it. Instead, she just started talking. Really talking for the first time. "You asked earlier if I'm okay," she said, with her eyes fixed on the glowing embers. "Truth is part of me is actually more scared of being found than staying lost out here. Of going back to that life where I'm just expendable, where nobody really sees me." I listened carefully with only the crackle of the fire filling the silence between her words. She told me about her past then, how she'd married young to some guy in the agriculture industry, but he left her after just a few years, because she was too rigid, too focused on her work. No kids, no family left, because her parents were gone and her siblings were estranged. She'd poured absolutely everything into her career and built these massive walls to keep people out so she wouldn't get hurt again. "I avoid eye contact because it hurts too much to let anyone in," she confessed, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's better to be seen as cold and professional than to be seen as broken." I shared my own story then because it only felt fair. I told her about growing up in a trailer park outside Missoula, about my dad, who was a logger, and drank too much before he split when I was 10, about my mom who worked 2 jobs to keep us fed, but passed from cancer just last year. I've been drifting ever since I said, while staring up at the stars, peeking through the trees above us. Loading crates, fixing fences, just getting by day to day. No big dreams, no real direction, just existing. Rebecca looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time since we'd met. "That's more than most people manage, Ryan," she said quietly. "You're steady. You're reliable. Those things matter more than you think." We talked late into that night, and the conversation flowed way easier than I ever expected it would. She actually laughed at one point, this soft, genuine sound, when I joked about my failed attempts at dating farm girls back home. "They all want someone with ambition," I said. "Me. I'm just happy with a quiet life and maybe someone to share it with." On the third day we ventured out looking for food. I managed to rig up a snare from some wire scraps I'd found and actually caught a rabbit. I skinned it with the multi-tool while Rebecca gathered edible berries she'd identified from some survival app knowledge she had stored in her head. As we cooked the meat over our fire, the smell of roasting flesh mixing with pine smoke filled the air, and I handed her a charred piece. "Not exactly 5-star dining," I said, trying to lighten the mood. She took it from me, and our fingers brushed again just like they had before. Then she smiled. Her first real genuine smile since the crash happened. It completely lit up her face and softened all those worry lines, making her look younger and more alive than I'd ever seen her. "It's perfect," she said, "because it's from someone who actually sees me, not the HR title or the age or any of that, just me." In that moment, sitting there in the middle of absolute isolation, I felt something shift between us. This woman who had always seemed so untouchable and unreachable was becoming real to me, And maybe, just maybe, I was becoming something real to her too. Days kept blurring together out there, but one night changed everything. We were huddled in our shelter during another brutal storm. The rain was pounding down, and wind was tearing at our makeshift walls. We'd gotten the fire going, but barely, and we were both soaked and shivering. I'd given her my jacket earlier, and she'd stopped arguing about it. As the temperature dropped even more, she moved closer to me, slowly at first, like she didn't want to admit she needed the warmth. Eventually, her shoulder pressed against mine, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in and her head tilted toward my arm. I froze for just a second, my heart racing. Then I relaxed and let her rest there. It felt completely natural, like two people just clinging to whatever comfort they could find. "Ryan," she murmured after a long silence, and her voice was so soft, I almost didn't hear it over the storm. "Thank you for everything you've done." I looked down at her, with her eyes half closed, and that hard exterior completely gone. "We're in this together, remember?" I said, and my hand instinctively rested lightly on her back. She didn't respond with words. She just sighed quietly and leaned in fully, with her head now resting against my shoulder. I stayed awake most of that night, listening to the rain and feeling her warmth seep into me. Her trust felt like this weight I hadn't expected, but absolutely welcomed. On the 9th day, we finally heard it. The distant thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the wind. We scrambled out, waving and shouting until rescuers spotted us. As they loaded us onto stretchers and the helicopter lifted off, I caught one last glimpse of our shelter. The fire pit, the wreckage that had become our entire world for over a week. The hospital, the news crews, the headlines calling us survivors and miracles. It all felt surreal. But when Rebecca was discharged and whisked away by union reps, she gave me this quick hug. "Thank you, Ryan, for everything," she whispered in my ear. Her eyes held that same vulnerability from the storm, but I could see a wall starting to rebuild. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I texted and called, but got nothing back. Days turned into weeks. Rumors started at the co-op about us getting cozy out there. Some people called me a gold digger, trying to use the story to climb the ladder. Then a union higher-up called saying there were reports of inappropriate behavior and that it could hurt Rebecca's promotion chances because of the age difference and our positions. I couldn't take the silence anymore. 2 weeks after the rescue, I drove to her house and knocked on her door. She opened it looking tired, but still beautiful in jeans and a sweater with no makeup. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" she asked. "You haven't answered any of my calls or texts," I said. "What's going on, Rebecca?" She let me in, and we sat on her couch. She explained how the media and union were watching her, how that promotion was hanging by a thread, how people would say I was just a fling or that she took advantage of me because of our age difference and positions. "I'm 43, and you're 26, she said with her voice cracking. People would destroy both of us over this. What happened out there was real, but back here in the real world, it's complicated. I pulled out the dried strip of rabbit jerky I'd kept from our last meal in the woods. "Remember this?" I asked. "We survived on this when we had nothing. Now the world's back with all its rules and judgments, and you're just going to let that push me away." Tears spilled down her cheeks and she took the jerky, her fingers brushing mine. "Ryan, I'm terrified of losing everything, of hurting you in the process." I moved closer and pulled her into a real embrace for the first time since the rescue. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing quietly. "Well, then don't," I whispered. "We'll figure this out together, just like we did out there." 1 year later, I quit the co-op and bought land near where we crashed. I built a cabin with my own hands, log by log. Rebecca showed up one fall morning with a duffel bag and announced she'd resigned from the union. The promotion, the expectations, the scrutiny. she was done with all of it. Life in the woods became our rhythm. I chopped wood and tended a garden while she took freelance consulting work. We cooked over open flames, read by candlelight, and let the locals whisper whatever they wanted about the age gap and our unconventional life. We never bothered with labels or ceremonies. What we had was born in isolation, forged in fear and fire out on that mountain. We didn't need validation from anyone else. In the quiet of that cabin, with no Wi-Fi half the time and no cell service, we found each other all over again. Two survivors who crashed into each other's lives and chose to stay. And honestly, that was enough for both of us.